Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Oh, yeah. Like it works like engineering or something.
Right. You fall, your arm hurts, and you go to the clinic. The doctor pulls up the x-ray, points to that jagged white line on the screen, and just says, well, there it is. That is the fracture.
It's very binary, very clean.
Yeah, the bone is broken or it's intact. We like things to be visible. We want our problems easily categorized so we know what to do next.
Which makes sense.
But then, you step into the world of human psychology. You step into the landscape of the spiritual condition, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just entirely useless.
Right, because we're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Yeah, you can't easily see what's happening on the inside just by observing the outside. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are analyzing a text that tries to build that spiritual x-ray machine.
And it does it in a very intense way.
It really does. So, for you listening, we're going to examine an intense, chilling 18th century sermon by Jonathan Edwards. It's titled Sinners in Zion Tenderly Warned, based on the biblical text of Isaiah chapter 33, verse 14.
To really grasp the weight of this text, we have to look past the surface level of historical religious rhetoric.
Okay, let's unpack this, because setting the scene is critical here.
It is. Edwards is not dealing in abstract theory here. He's performing a severe diagnostic evaluation of the people sitting right in front of him.
Wow, yeah.
He uses visceral, almost startling imagery to awaken his audience from a state of spiritual slumber. It helps to set the scene mentally.
Paint the picture for us.
So we're shifting from our fast-paced modern world into a dimly lit, historic New England meeting house in the 1740s.
Right.
The wooden pews are hard, the air is still, there's no background music playing.
No light shows or anything like that.
None at all. The person standing at the front is not walking around the stage trying to entertain. He's reading from a densely written manuscript, looking directly at his congregation.
And his goal is not to offer comforting platitudes to make everyone feel good about showing up, right?
No, he is delivering an incredibly severe warning about the danger of self-deception.
That mental image is crucial because it changes how we hear the words. Let's look at the core scripture from the source text.
Go for it.
The passage is Isaiah chapter 33, verse 14. Edwards quotes it like this: "The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings?"
It's heavy.
It is. And what stands out to me right away is the specific demographic he is targeting. Edwards is not talking to atheists.
Right.
He's not talking to the secular world outside the doors of the building. He is aiming this entirely at the visible church.
That distinction is the hinge on which this entire sermon turns, really. Edwards breaks down his categorization of humanity very systematically.
Operating out of that historical Reformed framework.
Spot on. Out in the broader world, you have people who are entirely outside the bounds of the covenant community. But then there is Zion.
And Zion is a metaphor, right?
Yeah, in biblical literature, Zion is a historical type, a metaphor for the church. Inside Zion, Edwards identifies two distinct groups: the truly godly and the hypocrites.
We should probably define how he's using the word hypocrite here.
We definitely should. Because in modern usage, a hypocrite is just someone who says one thing and does another.
Like a politician or something.
Yeah, exactly. But Edwards defines these individuals as people who make a profession of true religion. They show up every Sabbath, they listen to the preaching.
They check all the religious boxes.
Right. They participate in what are called the ordinances, meaning things like baptism and communion. But that outward show hides what he terms a natural condition.
Let's pause and clarify that term for anyone listening who might be unfamiliar with the theological jargon.
Good.
When Edwards talks about a natural condition, he is referring to an unregenerate state. In this framework, humanity is born spiritually dead, naturally inclined towards self-interest and rebellion against God.
Yeah, and being in a natural condition means the person has never experienced an internal spiritual resurrection.
Right. They might have learned how to mimic the behavior of a spiritually alive person, but internally nothing has changed.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
It's like, think of it like someone who wears the uniform of a team. They sit on the bench, they execute all the drills perfectly during practice.
Yeah.
But secretly, they are on the payroll of the opposing side. They look the part, but their internal allegiance is completely different.
That sports analogy captures the specific danger Edwards is trying to expose. The person in the uniform assumes their environment provides safety.
But it doesn't.
Not at all. Edwards uses imagery straight from the prophet Isaiah to describe the reality of that false safety. He talks about ground that brings forth no fruit, only stubble.
Which would have hit home for his audience.
Definitely. He describes an ancient agricultural practice that would have resonated intensely with his agrarian listeners in New England. He notes that in the ancient Near East, when the corn grew very rank, the farmers would reap the wheat, gather the valuable grain off the ground, and then literally set fire to the remaining stubble left in the field.
Why stubble specifically? Because stubble is, well, it's the dead leftovers. It has no root system anymore.
And it burns incredibly fast.
Right. It's just dry, brittle material taking up space.
Yes, it is fit for nothing else. The terrifying connection Edwards makes is that for the hypocrite in the church, their own breath, their own wicked speeches, their very nature acts as the fire that devours them.
Oh, wow. So they bring the fire with them.
Yeah, it's an internal consumption.
Yeah.
They are the fuel for their own destruction. He also uses the imagery of burning lime, where stones and bones are placed in an exceedingly fierce fire until they are completely burnt to ash.
That's a brutal image.
He compares these people to briars and thorns growing in God's field. They are an encumbrance. They take up resources, they drink in the rain, but they produce nothing of value. The farmer eventually has to clear the field, and their end is to be burned.
So what you're saying is he's essentially locking the doors of the church, looking at the people who think they are the safest people on earth, and telling them the call is coming from inside the house.
That is a great way to put it.
The danger isn't the pagan armies outside. The danger is the unaddressed spiritual rot sitting right in the pew.
And what makes this so severe is that, according to the text, the wrath of God is more especially manifested against this specific group than against the outsiders.
Which is wild to think about.
Edwards states that they are exalted nearest to heaven in this world by virtue of sitting in the pews and hearing the truth, but they will be lowest in hell in another.
Well, these sinners in Zion are currently sitting comfortably in the pews, feeling totally secure, which raises a logical question.
What's that?
How does the state of comfort shift into the sheer terror Edwards describes?
We have to look at the psychological state of these people first. Edwards observes that right now, these individuals are quiet and secure. They go about their 18th century daily lives without any disturbance.
Just going through the motions.
Yeah. They eat, they drink, they farm, they conduct their business. The loudest warnings from the pulpit do not move them. They can witness a time of general religious awakening in their town and stand there entirely unaffected.
Because they've built up an immunity.
Right. They've built a psychological fortress out of their church attendance and outward morality. But Edwards promises a massive, violent shift. He predicts a sudden, astonishing surprise of fear that will melt the stoutest heart.
And we have to look at how he maps out the progression of this fear. He doesn't just say, you will be scared.
No, he's much more methodical than that.
He breaks it down into 4 distinct, agonizing stages of awakening. The first stage is a deathbed realization.
And the way he describes this is incredibly detailed.
It really is. He walks through the progression of a dying person with a level of psychological realism that makes you feel like you are standing right in the room.
He connects this historical warning to a universal human anxiety.
The fear of running out of time and the realization that all your earthly status means absolutely nothing when your biology turns against you.
He starts with the onset of the illness. The individual is taken sick. Initially, they have great hope for recovery.
Because human nature always flatters itself that things will turn out well.
Always. They assume it's just a passing ailment, but the distemper prevails. The sickness deepens. The person watches, all the medical interventions fail.
And Edwards lived in an era before modern medical monitors and antibiotics. The progression of disease was something you had to watch play out on a person's face in real time.
You did. And he describes the exact moment the atmosphere in the room shifts. The sick person overhears whispering in the corner.
Oh, that detail is chilling.
Friends are telling each other that the patient's extremities are growing cold. They're pointing out the appearance of the death sweat on the forehead. The physician's face falls, and he quietly stops offering new treatments.
Then someone in the room feels bound by duty to tell the sick person the brutal truth. You are dying.
We have to consider the cognitive dissonance happening in the mind of the hypocrite at this exact second.
Right, because up until this moment, they were praying, making bargains with God about how strictly they would live if they were just spared this one time.
Yeah, they were hoping for some light, some token of favor based on their years of church attendance. But when the reality of imminent death sets in, the fearfulness Isaiah talked about finally surprises them.
They look at pale, grim death staring them in the face, and they realize eternity is only a few hours away.
And their internal bank account is completely empty.
Edwards uses this highly specific analogy here that really sticks in your mind. He says the dying man acts like a drowning victim.
The twig analogy.
Yes. The man catches at slender, brittle twigs and clenches his hands around whatever he sees within his reach. The dying person tries to tell his friends they are too frightened, arguing that the physical symptoms mean something else.
He's in denial.
He is grabbing at these tiny, fragile hopes. But as death creeps closer, he watches every single one of those twigs snap under his weight.
It is the realization of absolute unmitigated failure. The text notes that he feels the very frame of nature dissolving. He perceives that the soul is just about to be evicted from its home.
And the true terror, Edwards points out, is that the exercise of reason holds to the very last moment.
The mind stays sharp enough to understand exactly what is happening. The person knows they have no genuine interest in Christ.
The outward show has stripped away.
And their actual unrepented sins stare them in the face as the body fetches its last gasp.
The moment that last gasp happens, we move into the second stage, the departed soul. What actually occurs the second the soul leaves the physical body.
Edwards does not soften the blow here at all. He states that the union of the soul and body is broken, the soul forsakes its old habitation, and it immediately falls into the hands of devils.
To communicate the horror of this, he uses vivid animal metaphors.
Yeah, he asks the congregation to imagine the dreadful fear of a lamb or a kid goat falling into the paws of a starving wolf with its mouth wide open.
Or a little child pursued by a lion, seeing the devouring jaws open to tear it to pieces.
We have to remember the historical context here. In 1740s New England, wolves and bears were not abstract concepts seen only in zoos.
No, they were real, natural predators in the dark woods surrounding their towns. The fear of wild animal attacks was a legitimate, visceral part of frontier life.
He even brings in a specific biblical reference to heighten this, talking about the 2 and 40 mocking children who fell into the paws of Elisha's bears in the Book of Kings.
Which is an intense story on its own.
By referencing natural predation, Edwards is trying to capture the feeling of absolute paralyzing helplessness.
Even if we could perfectly imagine the terror of a child cornered by a lion, Edwards argues it is still only a faint shadow of what the departing soul of an unregenerate person feels.
It is the realization that you have stepped out of the physical world and instantly become prey.
Wow.
And beyond that immediate, terrifying seizure by demonic forces, the departed soul suffers amazing fears of what is yet to come. They know their current torment is eternal, but they also anticipate the future day of judgment, which brings an even greater dread.
That anticipation brings us to the third stage, the last judgment. Edwards describes the future physical resurrection of the dead.
He talks about Christ appearing in the clouds, the last trumpet sounding, and the souls being forced to re-enter their resurrected bodies with amazing horror.
The psychological detail he includes regarding the resurrection is fascinating.
He points out that this fear will be universal among the wicked, regardless of their earthly status, wealth, or bravery.
He specifically mentions valiant generals and princes.
Think about what a general represented in that era. These are men who, during their earthly lives, scorned to show fear in the face of an enemy army.
They scoffed at the roar of cannons and musket fire. They built their entire identity on physical courage and stoicism.
But moral exposure is entirely different from physical courage.
The contrast Edwards paints here is sharp. A general who would charge into a line of cannon fire without blinking is now utterly undone.
When they hear the last trumpet and see the majesty of the judge, their teeth will chatter.
Edwards says they will fly to hide themselves in caves and rocks, shrieking and begging the literal mountains to fall on them to cover them.
It would rather be crushed by millions of tons of rock than face the pure holy eye of the judge.
It demonstrates the sheer scale of the terror. Physical bravery means nothing when the issue is absolute moral exposure.
Edwards notes that the majesty of the judge will be intolerable to them. It will pierce them through, more terrible than flashes of lightning piercing their hearts.
The realization that every hidden thought, every secret hypocrisy, every fake religious gesture is now entirely visible creates a panic that breaks even the strongest human mind.
And then comes the final sentence. This is the fourth stage.
The trial closes, the doom is uttered.
And Edwards says it will be the most terrible voice ever heard by human ears. He describes it as more terrible than the sound of the trumpet that woke them from the dead.
Everyone on the left hand of the judge will physically sink under the sheer weight of that spoken sentence.
Stage 4 culminates with the kindling fire. The sentence is pronounced. Christ and the saints ascend, and the flames begin to kindle.
Edwards describes the visual of the entire world catching fire. Fire coming down from heaven, laying hold of the accursed multitude.
He details the physical reaction. Chattering of teeth, shaking of loins, violent distortions of the body as they begin to feel the actual fierceness of the flames.
The panic reaches its absolute peak here. The doomed individuals realize there is no escape route. They try to creep into holes, into deep caves.
Edwards pushes the imagery to the extreme, stating that even if they could creep down to the very center of the earth, it would be in vain.
The fire will set the bottoms of the mountains on fire and burn down to the lowest hell. There is no bunker deep enough.
He spends a significant amount of time detailing the progression of the fear and the desperate reaction to the judgment. He wants the congregation to feel the closing of the trap.
Wait, I am stuck on something here.
What's that?
He spends all this time talking about a literal sea of magma and physical burning. But we are talking about spiritual realities, right?
Yes.
If a soul is a spiritual entity, or even if they have a resurrected body that is built for eternity, how does a physical fire matter? Is Edwards just using primitive scare tactics to frighten uneducated farmers, or is there a specific theological mechanism he is operating under?
That is a highly critical question, and it's a point where modern readers often misunderstand historical theology.
So it's not just a cartoon pitchforks and flames thing.
Not at all. Edwards is not just relying on a cartoonish view of hell. He directly addresses the mechanism of the torment. He wants his congregation to grasp the intensity of the wrath.
Okay, so how does he explain it?
To do this, he first uses physical comparisons, because human beings are sensory creatures. We only understand the unknown by comparing it to the known.
That makes sense.
He breaks down 3 physical examples of extreme heat from their contemporary world. First, he points to glass-melting furnaces.
Oh, those were brutal.
Right. In the 18th century, early industrial glassmaking involved the absolute hottest, most terrifying display of human-made heat available. These furnaces were contrived for an extreme degree of heat, designed for running and refining metals and melting solid materials into liquid glass.
The heat was so fierce that stones would dissolve in it.
He asks the listener to imagine being brought to the mouth of such a furnace, feeling the radiant heat hitting your face, seeing everything inside glowing white and bright, and knowing you are about to be cast into it.
And the second comparison he makes leans into historical accounts. He talks about heathen cremation pits.
Yeah, he mentions how in certain cultures they would dig a massive pit, fill it with a huge quantity of wood and fuel, place bodies on the pile, and set it ablaze.
He uses this as a visual image of the burning of dead souls, asking the congregation to imagine standing at the edge of a massive glowing pit, about to be pushed over the edge.
The third comparison utilizes the science of his day. He points to burning glasses.
It's like a magnifying glass.
Exactly. In that era, natural philosophers were experimenting with large lenses that could concentrate sunlight to a focal point so intense it could quickly melt stones and sand.
And Edwards scales this scientific concept up to a cosmic level.
He predicts that the heat of the fire that will burn the world will be so concentrated it will melt the rocks and the solid ground, turning the entire surface of the earth into liquid fire.
He describes the entire visible globe turning into a vast ocean of liquid fire, where the wicked are tossed to and fro, with vast waves or billows rolling over their heads continually.
It's a terrifying imagery.
But back to the mechanism, how does he bridge the gap between this physical horror and the spiritual reality?
He bridges it by explicitly stating that all this physical fire is only an image. It is just a shadow of the true horror.
Which is what?
The true horror is found in his analysis the biblical text of Revelation chapter 19, verse 15, which speaks of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God.
Oh, that specific wording.
Yes, Edwards stops to analyze the specific grammar of that phrase. He argues that if the text had only said the wrath of God, that would be dreadful enough. The wrath of a human king is like the roaring of a lion, so the wrath of a divine creator would be terrifying.
But the text adds the word fierceness.
Right. It implies the active rage or fury of his wrath. And it is not just the wrath of God, but of Almighty God.
So it is the fierceness of omnipotence.
Precisely. The rage of a being of infinite strength, that is the spiritual reality behind the physical metaphor of the fire.
The theological mechanism of hell, according to Edwards, is the horror of a finite creature bearing the focused, unfiltered, active rage of an infinite, omnipotent being.
The fire is just the outward representation of the inward reality of being completely cut off from God's goodness, while being fully exposed to his justice.
And the weight of that exposure is compounded by the timeline. Edwards brings up the concept of everlasting duration.
He runs this terrifying thought experiment with the congregation.
If a person were brought to a glass furnace and told they would suffer inside it for only 1 single minute, the anticipation of that 1 minute would be so terrible that fearfulness would completely astonish them.
But then Edward scales the timeline up. He says, it is not 1 minute, it is not 1 day, it is not an age.
It's not 100 ages.
It is not 1,000,000 ages, it is forever and ever, without any end.
He notes the physiological and psychological state of the condemned. He says they will be full of quick sense within and without. Their heads, eyes, tongues, hands, and vitals will be full of glowing fire.
But more terrifyingly, they will eternally possess the most quick and lively sense to feel the torment. Their awareness will not dull over time.
They won't go numb.
No. Furthermore, they will have a far clearer sense of eternity than we do here on earth. In our current state, we cannot truly comprehend eternity. The concept swallows our thought.
We think in terms of days, years, and lifespans.
But in that state, the vastness of eternity will be crystal clear to their minds, and the thought of spending it in such a condition will sink them into a bottomless depth of despair.
The psychological breaking point of this is devastating to consider. Edward says the condemned will recognize they simply cannot bear the weight of it.
They will see that their human strength is absolute weakness. They cannot grapple with the fierceness of the flames or the active wrath of God.
And in that moment of complete cognitive and physical collapse, they will cry out with a very specific, desperate desire. They will want to return to their first nothing.
They will desire total annihilation. They will cry out, asking how they can possibly bear it, wishing they could just cease to exist entirely.
If existing means this level of exposure to divine wrath, non-existence becomes the ultimate fantasy.
But that refuge, that escape into nothingness, is denied. The theology dictates that the soul is immortal. They are never permitted to return to their first nothing.
After millions of ages have passed, they are absolutely no nearer to the end of their condition than they were the second they arrived.
It's a bleak picture.
This horrific fate sounds like a universal baseline for anyone who rebels against God in Edward's theological system. But he makes a shocking claim in the text.
He does.
He argues that the people he is talking to, the sinners in Zion, the comfortable churchgoers, have a unique, even worse position in this furnace.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back.
Why is a person sitting in the pew listening to the sermon judged so much more harshly than the pagan outsider who has never heard of the Bible?
Edwards states explicitly that sinners in Zion will have by far the lowest place in hell.
Wow.
He says the wrath of God against the wicked heathens will be mild and moderate in comparison with what the sinners in Zion will suffer. He says their shrieks will be louder, shriller, and more bitter than anyone else's.
This is a terrifying inversion of their expectations. They assume they are at the top of the spiritual hierarchy because of their religious affiliation.
Edwards puts them at the absolute bottom, and he breaks down 3 distinct, logical reasons for this heavier judgment, drawing heavily on legal and biblical principles regarding culpability.
We need to unpack those reasons because they explain the mechanics of this judgment. Reason 1 is sinning against greater light.
The concept of greater light refers to knowledge and revelation. Edwards uses the biblical principle that a blind man has comparatively no sin when he stumbles.
Right. If you don't know the rules, your violation of them is mitigated by your ignorance.
But the one who knows his master's will, who is informed, who has the light of the truth to know his duty, and yet intentionally disobeys, receives more stripes.
The person in Zion sits under the teaching of the moral law every single week. They know exactly what is required.
If the light in a person is actually darkness, that darkness is incredibly profound. Living in active, hidden wickedness while surrounded by the illuminating light of the church community is a massive aggravation of the sin.
It moves from ignorant stumbling to calculated treason.
That brings us directly to reason 2, sinning against professions and vows. The outsiders, the heathens, never pretended to be worshipers of the true God.
They didn't make covenant obligations. They didn't stand up in front of a congregation and make promises.
But the people in Zion did. Edwards uses a specific character comparison here that is brilliant for explaining the psychology of treachery. He compares Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate.
Oh, that's a brilliant contrast.
It perfectly illustrates the danger of feigned loyalty. Pilate was a pagan Roman governor. He had no covenant with the God of Israel. He was acting out of political expediency when he ordered the crucifixion.
Pilate was the murderer.
But Judas was the traitor. Judas was one of the inner circle. He ate with Christ, traveled with him, and claimed to love him, and then he betrayed Christ with a kiss.
Using a symbol of affection as the mechanism of betrayal.
Edwards points out that God highly resents falsehood and treachery. Because Judas feigned loyalty, his sin is treated as far worse than Pilate's pagan execution orders.
The hypocrite in the pew is acting the part of Judas, wearing the uniform of a friend while secretly working for the enemy.
Reason 3 is perhaps the heaviest of the logical arguments, sinning against greater mercy.
The hypocrite sitting in the church has been offered the infinite mercy of God on a silver platter.
They have had the dying love of Christ represented to them vividly in sermons and sacraments. They have been offered the Savior, his blood, and his righteousness to cover their natural condition.
A massive price is put into their hands. They possess the Holy Scriptures. They enjoy the Sabbaths, the community, the various means of grace.
We should explain what Reformed theology means by the means of grace.
Let's do that.
These are the ordinary tools God uses to communicate salvation and spiritual growth to his people, specifically the preaching of the Word, the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and prayer.
And the people in Zion have full access to these tools. They sit under the preaching, they watch the water poured, they eat the bread and drink the wine.
And what do they do with all of that provision?
They abuse, despise, and reject it. They treat it as a social club rather than a rescue operation.
Right. Edwards provides a synthesis of his logic here that is absolutely chilling. He states, "There is no wrath like that which arises from mercy abused and rejected."
When mercy is continually offered and continually ignored, it eventually turns into the fiercest wrath possible.
He compares this to the fall of humanity. In Reformed theology, the first Adam broke the world by disobeying God's law in the garden. But Christ is referred to as the second Adam, the one who comes to fulfill the law and provide the cure for the fall.
Edwards argues that the fall by the first Adam is light in comparison to the fall by the second Adam.
Meaning, rejecting Christ, the ultimate, costly provision of mercy, is a far greater catastrophe than the original breaking of the law.
It is the difference between catching a terminal disease through natural circumstances and having the doctor hand you the guaranteed cure only for you to look the doctor in the eye and pour the medicine down the drain.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Sitting in the presence of the cure, knowing what it is, claiming you have taken it, and yet secretly discarding it, it is a terrifying indictment.
This entire text is incredibly heavy and dark. It systematically deconstructs any false sense of religious security.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. After spending all this time talking about the cosmic end of the world and eternal timelines, Edwards does something jarring.
It really pivots.
He does not end the sermon in despair. He stops talking about eternity, looks directly at the specific people sitting in the room, and points out what is happening right outside their windows.
The text suddenly becomes hyper-local and incredibly urgent.
We have to understand the historical context of what Edwards is referencing in this final section.
He is pointing to a present, undeniable reality in their community. He tells them God is doing great things right now. There is a current outpouring of the Spirit.
He is referring to the historical period we now call the Great Awakening.
This was a massive social and spiritual phenomenon sweeping through the colonies. He brings up the fact that God had wonderfully appeared among them some years ago during a previous revival, but then the momentum faded.
God seemed to depart, leaving the town in a dull, dead state for years, where there were scarcely any conversions and people went back to their normal routines.
But now, Edwards says, that same God has returned. The doors open again.
He describes God actively rescuing souls as brands out of the burnings.
The imagery is vivid. A brand is a piece of wood already on fire, snatched out of the hearth at the last possible second.
He talks about God opening prison doors and knocking off heavy chains. He is telling them that God is actively working salvation from the very destruction he just spent the entire sermon describing.
And this current reality creates a very narrow, urgent doorway of opportunity. Edwards uses the imagery of God standing in a wide-open doorway, calling and begging with a loud voice to the sinners in Zion to fly to him for refuge.
He compares the situation to the biblical story of Lot in the book of Genesis.
Lot was urgently hastened by angels to run out of the city of Sodom before the fire and brimstone fell from the sky.
The command is not to think about it, not to form a committee to discuss it, but to make haste, fly for your life, and escape to the mountains.
The flames are coming, but the door is currently open.
But there's a huge psychological warning embedded in this plea. Edwards understands human nature perfectly. He warns them about the fickle, unsteady, self-deceiving nature of the human heart.
He brings up a highly specific historical warning for this particular congregation. He reminds them of people in their own town who were awakened and terrified during the last revival, but eventually grew careless.
Yes, he notes that during the previous awakening, religious talk was lively. People were terrified of hell and actively sought salvation.
But human beings cannot sustain a state of panic indefinitely. As the general zeal in the town abated and these individuals saw their neighbors growing less zealous, they began to listen to internal excuses.
The psychology of losing conviction is subtle. They started thinking they did not need to be quite so strict.
They convinced themselves there was no real harm in certain practices they had previously abandoned. By giving way to minor temptations and hearkening to rationalizations, they slowly lost their convictions and became totally secure in their sin once again.
Edwards drops a devastating theological diagnostic on these specific people. He says they are now in a twice so dangerous state as they were before they were ever awakened.
That phrase, twice so dangerous, is haunting.
It means their proximity to the previous revival, without actually crossing the threshold of true internal faith, acted like a spiritual inoculation.
They got just enough of the dead virus to build an immunity to the real thing. They became resistant to the very grace that was supposed to save them.
Because they felt the fear once and survived it without changing, they now assume they can survive anything.
And Edwards pushes this further with a practical, grim reminder about the sheer urgency of mortality. He tells them death does not wait for men to indulge their sloth.
He asks a pointed, almost sarcastic question. Will you put off seeking salvation in hope of seeing another revival 7 years from now?
He points out the mathematical reality that many of the people sitting in the room may be in hell before another 7 years elapse. Death will be too quick for them.
You cannot schedule your spiritual awakening around the cultural calendar.
There's also a fascinating demographic detail he includes in this final plea. It is a generational warning.
Edwards points out that in this current outpouring of the Spirit, God is moving chiefly on the youth of the town.
He observes that the people being brought forward, the ones experiencing genuine conversion, are the young people who were not yet on the stage of action during the last revival.
They are fresh. They have not been inoculated yet.
Meanwhile, the older individuals, the ones who had convictions during the previous revival, quenched them, and went back to sleep, are now abundantly more hardened. God seems to be passing right over them.
To drive the agony of this home, Edwards uses a harsh biblical parallel. He references the story of the Israelites in the wilderness from the book of Numbers, chapter 14.
This is the generation that saw the massive miracles in Egypt, saw the Red Sea part, but still rebelled and refused to trust God to enter the Promised Land.
Correct. And because of that specific rebellion against great light and mercy, God swore that entire adult generation would wander and die in the wilderness. They would never see the Promised Land.
But their little ones, the children the adults claimed would become prey in the wilderness, those were the exact ones God promised to bring in to possess the land.
Edwards uses this historical narrative to warn the hardened adults sitting in his congregation. He asks them, "Shall children, babes, and sucklings go into the kingdom of God before you?"
How will you bear the psychological torment of seeing your own children, the youth of your town, sitting down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, while you yourselves are thrust out into the dark?
It is a devastating, isolating question to end the sermon on. The psychological pain of seeing your children get the exact rescue you assumed was yours simply because they were genuine while you were playing a part is immense.
As we bring this analysis to a close, we have to recognize the sheer intellectual and emotional weight of what Edwards accomplished in this text.
He took the concept of religious hypocrisy, placed it under a theological microscope, and systematically deconstructed it.
He left absolutely no room for anyone to hide behind their perfect church attendance, their outward morality, or their historical family name.
He forces a complete confrontation with the reality of internal spiritual deadness. He demands that the listener stop looking at their outward behavior and start examining the actual nature of their affections.
And that brings the diagnostic right back to you, listening to this right now.
Why does an 18th century sermon about furnaces and stubble matter today? It matters because human nature has not evolved past the desire for false security.
This text forces an uncomfortable look at the massive gulf between simply being in proximity to a moral community and possessing genuine internal virtue. It asks you to verify your own spiritual pulse.
If we pull this back to the broader human condition, it leaves us with a final thought to consider.
If Edwards is correct in his assessment that proximity to the truth without internalizing it actually multiplies your guilt, how should that alter the way individuals today approach casual participation in any moral, ethical, or religious community?
We often assume that associating with good people makes us good.
But does claiming the label without possessing the internal substance actually make you the most vulnerable person in the room?
Think about that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation. You might have a clean bill of health on paper. You might look perfectly sound from the outside, wearing the right clothes and saying the right words.
But only a true, honest diagnostic of the internal heart will reveal if you are standing on solid ground.
Or if you are just grabbing at brittle twigs, waiting for the storm to hit. Thank you for joining this session of Reformed Thinking. We will catch you on the next deep dive.